Hello, and welcome to this introduction to Waldorf homeschooling. My name is Nicholas the Bard Andrea, or simply known to my students as Mr. Andrea. In this video, I'm going to give you an introduction to the Waldorf method of education, perhaps speak to why use this method, what's efficacious about it, what's unique about it, what's important about it. Then I'm going to go to a short introduction to myself and my own journey with this particular path of education. Then I'll talk a little bit about the multi-sensory approach that this education brings, and then touch briefly on homeschooling. Okay, so let's start with this picture. And actually, before I get into the details here, I just want to say a note about the word Waldorf. I'm using this word, Waldorf education, because it is becoming commonly known in the world as, a different path of educating human beings. I would call it freedom education, and maybe we can touch on that a little bit later. But what this word actually means is perhaps undergoing evolution in our time. It's kind of like how the terms Republican and Democrat once meant something and then at some point seemed to kind of flip in a certain way. That could be happening with Waldorf. So strictly speaking, I don't really know what it means anymore. I can just tell you what it means to me and what I bring into the education. And that's what I'm about to explain here. That's what I'm going to get into. So I would say, for me, what Waldorf refers to is an education that's based on a holistic understanding of the human being and his and her path of incarnation and excarnation through this journey of human life on earth. So it's a scientific understanding of the human being, but it's a holistic science, which is to say a science that doesn't stop merely at what can be observed in a purely sensory way, that is, doesn't stop at an understanding of the human being as merely a physical being, but includes other parts of the being, of the psyche, of the soul, of the spirit, and has a map for how these things interplay. Now, as an aside, such maps often come from people with a special ability to see, seers, people who can see into unseen realities, and us mere mortals at some point have to consider it as a possibility. But here's the thing: you don't actually have to be a seer to know if this is true or not. You just put it into practice and you see. And I can tell you stories from my own journey as a teacher in this vein. And I don't want to take too much time here to do it, but I'm happy to share those with you. But the point is, you just test it out and see. And you just observe children, and you observe human beings, and you can start to see for yourself that these things are true. So what do we have here? This is a picture of human life broken up into 7-year periods, okay, of life. So here we have the first 7 years of life. And this is the young child, okay? And there are certain capacities and tasks of development during this time, which are different than during other times in a person's life. This would not be news to anybody who has studied child development, but we're going to get into more specifically what those are. So 0 to 7, these are the early childhood years. Sometimes children go to nursery or kindergarten during these years. Ideally, they spend a lot of time at home with their parents and maybe grandparents and other loving, nurturing community members, and lots of time in nature. Then we have the period of 7 to 14, and these are traditionally the grade school years, first to 7th or 8th grade, and they have a certain task. Then we have 14 to 21, the high school and college years. They have a certain task. Then we have 21 to 28, 28 to 35, 35 to 42. You'll see here that this is the bottom of the bathtub. This is when a human being is most incarnated, actually. And these are kind of the three periods of the soul life. Okay? And then the excarnation process starts. Actually, this very day, I am transitioning from this period to this period. And 42nd birthday. Then we have these periods of excarnation. Now, these are related. Okay, so in this first 7 years, the main task is to develop a sense of goodness, that the world is a good place. And if this is developed well, then during this period, when somebody might become a grandparent, they will be able to reflect that goodness in the sense of a kind of bestowing of blessing, of benevolence. So we see here, goodness is primarily concerned with deeds, what people do, good deeds. That's why the education in these first 7 years is really about doing, right? It shouldn't be about academics. It should be about doing, right? Being on jungle gyms, climbing, walking on balance beams, learning to ride bikes, and being surrounded by healthy fibers and nourishing foods and that sort of stuff. This is education of the will. It's not a time to teach academics. Okay, that comes later. By the way, as a total side note, I live kind of on a farm, so if you hear chickens or strange other sounds in the background, you'll know what that is. Okay. Anyway, so these years 7 to 14 are about beauty. This is about developing the heart and the feeling sense, the moral sense, what's good and what's not in terms of what's aesthetically pleasing in a moral sense, as well as in an artistic sense, right? And that's why in these grade school years, we need to do a lot of art and tell a lot of stories. It's not just about hardcore academics. It's also about, an aesthetic education. And if we miss this, then we risk our children growing up into morally bankrupt human beings with some kind of sociopathic tendencies because their moral well is dried up. Look at the world today. Look at how many powerful people seem to be kind of heartless. Could it be because of the way we've been educating them? And I'm going to just say this. I think public school, in general, totally misses the boat here. They do too much intellectualism too early. this is really the time to accelerate that. I mean, here in middle school, in these years, you can start to give some content that has some more teeth, so to speak. But in these 14 to 21 years, when it's the search for truth, when they want to know what's true, right? Which is why they get so argumentative and combative and rebellious in a way, because they want to know what's true for themselves, not just because the authority of the teacher says it, which is more the case here, but because they want to see it themselves, right? And that's really the time to get heavy on the academics and the intellectual training. So you see, we have to understand this. And again, you don't have to be a great seer to develop good instincts with this stuff. Okay. And of course, like I said, these periods, on the other side of the life cycle are reflections of that. There's a geometry here to human life. There's a sacred geometry. So if you want to know, what is it that this holistic science, spiritual science, or if you will, Waldorf-based educational approach understands? It understands that there's a geometry to human life. You see these little icons of a plant. I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But there's a geometry to human life. There's a way it proceeds. And the whole purpose is to harmonize with that geometry, because if you give the right thing at the right time, it's nectar, it's medicine. If you give the right thing at the wrong time, it's poison. So, for example, a first grader or a second grader still living very much in a fairy tale consciousness, that's natural. Now, you can pull them out of it by unnaturally or artificially stimulating their head forces too early, and that can cause problems later on in the life, even physical illnesses, okay? But naturally, they're more in a fairy tale consciousness. So that's why we tend to bring the academic content during those early years through fairy tales and folk tales, right? This is not the time to do physics or earth science. And I've seen some very well-meaning alternative schools do this kind of thing, and it makes me cringe. Now, is that to say they're not to go out in nature and experience it? No, of course, they should totally be in nature and totally experiencing it. You just don't bring it in this intellectual way. They just notice the rain, they notice the rocks, they feel them, they experience them, they maybe even draw pictures of them. That's all great. You just don't need to bring an intellectual concept like the water cycle, and evaporation of water and stuff like that at this early age. You can put it in pictures. You can say, well, there's a bunch of water fairies that get warm on a sunny day in a little pond or puddle on the street, and they get so hot they want to fly, so they take off and they start flying to get some more space, and they cool off, and it's so nice, but then it gets quite cold up there, so they start clumping together and saying, hey, let's huddle and get warmer, and so they clump together and they become a cloud, and then they get so heavy they fall back to earth, right? You bring it in pictures, not in these heady intellectual concepts. This is the importance of understanding what to bring and when. And that's what we do in this education. Geometry. So a plant starts as a seed, okay? And then it sprouts and becomes a leaf. And then that leaf becomes bud. Okay? And then obviously the bud becomes the blossom. And then the blossom, this is all outward motion. Yeah? Seed, sprouting, And then, I mean, even though there is a kind of a rhythm to it, like contractive seed sprouting into a leaf, contraction into the bud, sprouting into the blossom, but still, this is kind of a rising outward motion. And then, boom, the blossom expresses itself. This is sort of the identity of the plant. It's what really makes a plant most unique from other plants. You can really tell them by their blossoms, colors, shape, and all that, smell. And then it turns inward, right? The blossom turns inward on, pistil and stamens. The pistil takes in the pollen and it starts to turn inward. Okay? And then it becomes even more inward in the sense, even though this fruit is growing outward, but there's also this inward motion. I mean, cut open an apple, you'll see this. And it's protecting the seed, right? And then it falls and it gives a new seed. So in the plant, in the life of a plant, we have a picture of the soul journey of a human being. In these early years, going outward, 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 outward. And at some point, the process turns inside of itself, turns inward, right? And there's also a polarity here. If you go across, like old seed, new seed, right? Here, what is leaf and fruit do? Well, they feed in a way. Like the leaf's purpose is to feed the plant, right? The fruit's purpose is, in a sense, you could say, to feed the world, right? Because this apple falls, and then animals will eat it, or humans will eat it, and then hopefully drop the seeds. In this case, we have reproduction starting, right? So this is also interesting. The bud is correlated to these years of puberty, right? When a human being is becoming reproductive, right? That's what the purpose of the bud is, right? But here we have this outward motion, right? The bud is like it's going to be opening, right? Seeking the pollinators to come. Here they've come, and now it's turning inward. That organ is now going to make a new generation. Okay? And then where the whole thing turns inside out is here at the blossom. So really, this is a way of looking at the human being that's encoded into nature itself. That's what's captured my heart, my imagination about this particular approach to education, is it's based on something that's interwoven into the very fabric of reality. It's not arbitrary. It's not some clever thing that somebody just came up with. This was seen, discerned in the very fabric of nature. So that's what we're offering you here. Okay? All right. I want to take a few moments and go to a clip from an introductory video to 5th grade I did not so long ago, and it talks a little bit about my journey with Waldorf. So let's go to that now. Okay, so to begin with, I am a Waldorf teacher. That's my background, that's my love, that's the path I deeply believe in. I sort of found my way, one could say, by mistake or by happy accident or by synchronicity. I like to say by a kind of breadcrumb trail of obvious signs pointing me to the Waldorf school. And I went and I observed a lesson of, I think it was a combined 3rd and 4th grade class at that time. And what I witnessed there changed my life forever, because I saw students that were not just sitting in their seats the whole time, but were actually engaged with their bodies, or singing, or doing speech work. And they were also, doing seated work as well, but that included, hearing this wonderful lesson that was given in a very imaginative form, and then doing some artistically academic work about that lesson. And I was completely floored by what I saw, because I had never seen students so engaged, enthusiastic, and interested in learning. And I said to myself after that, whoa, what is this? I have to be involved. And at that time, I was even willing to give myself as a volunteer to the school, because what I witnessed was too inspiring not to become involved in. So I vowed to involve myself in it. Like I said, even as an unpaid volunteer, it just moved me that much. And I guess it's those things that we're willing to do, that we're interested in doing beyond the money, right, that are our true calling. And so one thing led to another. I originally got hired as a music teacher and an aftercare teacher, and then at the end of that first year, I was asked if I would take a class as a lead teacher, and I did, and the rest is history. All right. Now I want to turn to this. We'll talk a little bit about the multisensory approach to these lessons, to Waldorf lessons, to my especially individual approach to it. And by the way, you can see these things if you download the sample lessons for different grades that I've done. It gives you kind of a cross section of how I do my lessons. You'll see this multisensory approach. So I've talked a little bit about this, the years 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21. That's what we're concerned with here. Of course, development goes on beyond that. But in terms of educating our children, this is what's important. So these first 7 years, so there's physical development and there's soul development, okay? That's why I have two, human beings drawn here, albeit very simplistically. The first 7 years, you'll notice that the child is basically a head being, right? They're like mostly head. And I'm going to just kind of caricature this here, but, they have big heads when they're babies. So physically, they're in a developmental stage where the head is developing. But actually, or I should say, on a soul level, what's developing is their will. That is to say, their movement, their sense of touch, their ability to sense their own life wellness or not, so the rhythms of life, healthy rhythms of eating, drinking, sleeping, wearing clothes that are, natural materials, and getting lots of time in nature, experiencing nature, digging in the mud, getting their hands dirty. You should let them get dirty during these years. That's good for them. Don't keep them cooped up inside, playing video games. That's not good for them. So it's an irony that physically their head is developing, but on a soul level, it's their will. And that's what we need to educate in these first 7 years. So 7 to 14, it's the heart, or this middle section, and the life of feeling, okay? Art is the language of the heart. That's why we need to do a lot of art in the grade school years, because they learn through it. I can't tell you how many times I've been bringing a subject, it's too dry, and all of a sudden I say, okay, well, you guys are wizards, you're dragons, and, all of a sudden, wow. Now it comes to life, and that little simple adjustment makes all the difference in the lesson. Understanding child development. What's the right thing at the right time, okay? 7 to 14, heart, feeling development. So, physically, the chest becomes prominent. Go look at a 9-year-old, and you'll see that they're kind of like beings of chest. It's interesting to see them. Their limbs haven't really started to grow in the way they do in puberty, but they just seem to be chess beings. It's kind of interesting. Just go study them. This is what I mean about you don't have to be a seer to see that these things are true and valid. You just go observe. I mean, you can educate your instinct with these ideas, but then just go and observe. 14 to 21. This is another irony, right? The limbs start to grow. But on a soul level, it's the thinking. With the hardening of the bones comes the hardening of the intellect. And so our head, chest being now becomes a head, chest, limb being, and start to reach their adult proportions. Okay? And this is when we need to school the thinking. So what does this mean in terms of lessons? Well, because the human being at every stage, I would say really starting in the grades anyway, is a thinking, feeling, will, being, we incorporate this into each lesson. So how do we speak to the feeling? Songs, verses, stories, art, imagination, right? Like, I'll give you an example. We're talking about volcanoes. And I mean, I think volcanoes are pretty interesting to a lot of people, but you could bring them in a very dry way. But then let's go ahead and tie it to history and talk about Pompeii and Vesuvius, and then have the students do an assignment where they write a first-hand account of being in Pompeii when Vesuvius was erupting, right? So there we're actually speaking to the thinking and the feeling and the will, okay? We also do movement, like coordination, different coordination exercises, often with music, right? That's speaking especially to the will, but also to some degree to the feeling and the thinking. And then in the thinking, mental math. With every lesson we do, every academic lesson gets mental math. So there, we're speaking also to the thinking, okay? This is a multi-sensory approach. It's natural. Why wouldn't you do that if you understand child development? So sometimes I hear about these alternative approaches. They say, oh, we're multi-sensory. We're speaking to the multiple intelligences. And I say, that's great. Waldorf has been doing that since 1919, or whenever it started, 1919, 1920. I'm not trying to denigrate those other philosophies. They're great. I'm just saying, for me, it's all here. It's one-stop shop. It's whole. Okay. So, lastly, I just want to touch on homeschooling. Why homeschool? Well, if you're here watching this, I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir. But what I've seen is that, people love having the freedom to choose what their children are learning, when they learn. Some people like to travel, so it's a great way to do that, when you're not sedentary in one place and able to access a brick and mortar school. People are also increasingly seeking freedom from unwanted influences. There have been a number of state legislations in different realms that affect children and what they're learning in school and even their ability to attend school, which people want to retain the freedom to choose in those regards. I think that's important. People also want freedom from unwanted influences. There are sometimes complexes that children can develop at school, even, more well-meaning schools. And of course, people also just want the freedom to explore. If their child is, say, learning, about the Renaissance or something, and they want to just take a week and dive into Da Vinci's, all of his different ideas for helicopters and, that kind of stuff. and engineering, and they can do that. And that's awesome. Now, some people will say, but what about their social development? Yeah, well, most homeschoolers that I know have homeschool groups as well. They learn at home, and then a couple times a week they go and join groups for different things. So I think it's very possible to get that. And I just have to say, from my personal experience, and this is what really started to help me turn the course of my own path. I started meeting these young adults that had been homeschooled. And I noticed a common characteristic amongst them. They seemed to be the most well-adjusted, self-knowing, confident young adults I was meeting anywhere. And it just piqued my interest. I said, whoa, something's going on here with this homeschooling thing. And so just as when I first met Waldorf Education and observed it, I said, well, I have to be involved. Once I started experiencing homeschoolers and homeschooling, a similar spark ignited, like, whoa, I've got to be involved. There's something really healthy in this. So I hope this introduction has been helpful to you. And I hope that we can, at Enkindle Academy, be of a service, can be an asset to you and your journey, whether you're a homeschooler or a teacher still teaching in a brick and mortar school, which is so important to have good and inspired teachers. I hope we can be an asset to you and your work. Okay, well, that's all I have. Thank you. And hopefully we'll see you for the next lesson. Take care. Bye-bye.